Okay, I want to talk a little bit about some of the tools that a lot of our keyboard players and guitar players are using that seems to escape some of us bass players when we think about putting lines together. And it's an idea of like leveraging like passing chords, okay? And there's no reason why a bass player we can't use those sort of intermediate changes or those transitional chords in our own bass lines, okay? So I want to show you like a handful of like different approaches that are like sort of pretty well known in like the keyboard world and the guitar world that we're gonna borrow, okay? So I'm gonna take a progression here. I'm gonna go from G major to E minor to a B minor. So I'm just kind of like playing around with those, you know, the main chord tones on that. But I'm going to keep it super simple, okay? And you might notice or recognize, I'm pretty sure that that progression is a Pink Floyd Making Plans for Nigel, which I think goes something like... I wanted to pick it because there's some big jumps in there, and there's a lot of room for like some transitions, some transitional chords that we can use like temporarily to like ease those transitions if you wanted to, okay? I'm not gonna suggest like this is how you should play that tune. I just want to show some of the tools our friends tend to use that a lot of us bass players just like don't grab onto. Or maybe we do, but we don't realize we're doing it. So I'm gonna walk through a few really common tools, transition chords, keyboard players, guitar players use all the time to sort of like create movement in these kinds of progressions, okay? So the first one is a really simple one, okay? It's you would just take and patch, you know, diatonic chords in between those. So if we're in the key of G major, we got the 1 chord here, we're going to the 6, and then we're going to the 3. So a really simple thing to do might be to go, a really simple transitional maneuver might be to approach each of those goal chords with a neighboring diatonic chord, okay? So for example, I might go from G major to, let's say, D major to the E. So that D major becomes a transition between what would have just been so we're going and of course I can use some of the notes in that transitional chord, right? So I can go and I'm gonna play very mechanically here so you can see what I'm talking about. I'll just play like the arpeggios. Okay, so I use that D, I walk through it kind of sort of in an up and down way, but really it's just okay. And I could do the same to the B here. Maybe I'll take and use that 4 chord to step to that. So all of a sudden I might get something that's more like this. So that's still sorry, that should be there. If I chord those, you can hear the sound that we're going for here. So we get instead of just right, we get some transitions. So those are like just picking neighboring chords, like neighboring diatonic chords, is a simple way to just add transitions. Okay, and you're just using them as a stepping stone to get to where you're going. Okay, so that's like the really sort of obvious and very sort of inside sounding way of moving in and around. So I'm going to show you some others that people will use. This next one would be what is commonly referred to as the like secondary dominant approach. And the idea is really simple, that basically every chord you're approaching, you can approach it by playing the fifth above the chord you're moving to. So in this progression where we go from G to E minor to B minor, basically what we're saying is that we can go from to create this passing tone between the G and the E. Well, I'll find the fifth away from E, which is actually B, and I'll play like a B dominant if you want, or just a B major even. Keep it simple, you know. And then to get to that B, well, a fifth away from that is this F sharp, right? And then a fifth away from this G is that D. So then you end up getting a progression that could sound like okay. I know I'm playing a lot of stuff there, but I'm just noodling around on the chord tones of those what you know, the secondary dominant idea. It's just basically prefix every chord you're approaching with the chord a fifth away from it. You know, like each chord has its own 5 chord, you know. If I was playing like all of the you know, 7th chord types, but you can hear that it's starting to get colorful. So that's a really common one. Okay, one that's like very I would argue is really the same thing, just a different way of voicing that dominant, is to basically use a diminished chord a half step behind the note or the root that you're headed towards. Okay, so in this case, to get to that E there, right, I would play a diminished behind the E, I'm just playing like variants of a diminished. A diminished chord, for those who don't know, is a chord based entirely out of minor thirds, right? So for example, those are all minor thirds apart, right? There's lots of ways to play that, but you don't only have to pick a couple of the important ones, but you know, you get something that sounds like this. I'll play a diminished like this here to that B minor, and then there's that. So you can basically prefix any chord you're approaching with a diminished chord a half step behind it. It's very much the same concept, and it actually sounds a lot like that secondary dominant approach I just showed you, where you just prefix every chord you're approaching with its very own dominant resolution. Okay, so yeah, I would kind of put that in the same department. And another really common one is just to either take the chord itself that you're approaching, and depending on like where you are, just play the exact chord like a half step above or a half step below. So in this case we have G major, right, going down to that E minor. Well, you could say, here's a transition chord, and to get up to that B, I might take a half step behind it, and I might take for that G a half step behind it. So I end up with these parallel movements that are just a half step above or below, but I get so that's a very, very common one. And those don't necessarily have to be just a half step above or below. You know, like you can kind of pair some of these up sometimes. Like there's this concept, you know, a lot of your keyboard players will know about. It's called enclosures, and basically what that's doing is you're sort of boxing stuff in. So here's an example of like an enclosure, a chordal enclosure, you know, around that. I'll do it around the B because it's just because. So I'm just half step above, half step below, see, I went like, there's a way you could split that up, like you can kind of like dance around in parallel and land on it. These are like enclosures. You're wrapping the chord in like chord tones that are kind of like right beside it, okay? And those are parallel, like I'm playing the exact same chord, just half step below and above before I resolve. And I just kind of did a very similar thing there. Instead of just prefixing with a half step below my G, you know, I did a half step below, another half step. You know, I basically walked up to it. So I kind of see like enclosures and those kind of parallel movements is kind of like all sort of being more or less like same ways of getting towards that in a parallel chord fashion. And I guess that probably takes me to the last one, which is kind of like a cyclical approach. And the idea there is finding like a patterned way to approach it. So that those half steps walking up, in a way, that's a cyclical approach. I'm repeating a series of like equal steps in parallel towards something. So I could, on that, resolving to that G, for example, I could cycle downward, let's say in half steps. So, right, if those are just temporary passing chords, if you will, transitional chords, I did half step cycles. You could do whole steps. You could do minor thirds. And you could do major thirds. As a giant steps, Coltrane's giant steps is like basically a cycle of major thirds. That progression is cycling through major thirds. You could have something like, so there's only so many cycles. Like whole steps, whole steps and half steps are pretty common. Yeah. A lot of times, like minor third jumps can work really well too, especially if it's like landing on like a dominant or a subdominant chord. Like, so in this progression, we have a 1 going to the 6, going to the 3. That 3 is actually kind of like, it has like a dominant quality, in that it wants to resolve to that 6. And it also just happens to be a minor third away from the natural 5. It's so it wouldn't be that weird to hear, a stepwise movement down from, in that. So for example, here's the secondary dominant, right? And then I'm going to walk down to that 3. So I hope I haven't thoroughly confused everybody with that, but these, I know I'm playing chords right now, but you want to think of this as like, how could you take those passing chord ideas and like incorporate them in a linear fashion into your bass lines, Oh, before I forget, there's one more that's really cool, and it's kind of like I'd call it like a pivoting chord, that finding a chord that creates sort of like a tension between all of them, and it's sort of like you rebound off of it. I'll show you what I mean here. So for example, if I were to so for example, if I was to play a no, here's a good example. So I'm going to play, let's say this chord here, the off the G. So the what is that? The E flat? The E flat major as a pivot chord, okay? So I keep like just pivoting off of that like E flat chord. Why did I pick the E flat major chord? Well, that chord in relation to like these other chords tends to create, it doesn't really belong to the key of G major, and you know, in the case where it's transitioning to this E minor, it's kind of a half step behind. In the case where it's transitioning to this, it's kind of it's sort of stepping it just sort of, I could have picked the 5 chord, you know, and done the same thing. It's just a chord that tends to create tension no matter which of those positions I bounce back and forth from, and it can act as a transitional chord. And the repetition of hitting that can be kind of interesting. Yeah. So don't feel restricted by like the key that you're in, you know, like these transitional chords, they're just sort of there temporarily to help create like a bit of movement or a bit of tension to get you to those other chords that they may or may not need like a little help. But you'll know when you have something that just feels like, I need to kind of create like a bit of movement. You know, especially when you're in situations where, you know, you're on a chord and you need to almost actually just like come back to the same chord. Like, do you have some device, you know, you can use? Really common one for that case, you know, where let's say you're playing all of those same examples I just showed you could apply to this, you know, if you're staying, let's say, on that B, you know, and it's just getting boring. You're staying on that B for 2 bars. You can use all those same things. Yeah. One of the other ones you can use is a diminished over the same. The diminished right in the same position will create the tension you need to give it a little bit of like, give it a little bit of restlessness so you can kind of land back on it. Anyways, of course, I'm playing all these in a chordal way. You know, you want to kind of like take these and, you know, write lines, and probably the easiest way to do that is just to kind of figure out, you know, what the arpeggios are, like what the key chord tones are, and kind of like, you know, walk around them. And it doesn't have to be all the chord tones, just maybe 1 or 2 even. It'll add some movement. All right.